The night my sister-in-law told an entire dinner table that my disappearance wouldn't matter. Everyone laughed. A year later, those same people were standing in my wedding venue, staring at me like they had never seen me before. How did that happen? How does a woman go from being invisible at her own family table to owning the very place where they beg for help? My name is Emily Crawford. I'm an event operations manager and co-owner of a wedding venue in Charleston, South Carolina. But the story I'm about to tell you didn't begin here, in this bright office overlooking the harbor. It began 1 year earlier, at a dinner table, where I learned exactly how little I meant to the people I had spent 7 years trying to impress. And the worst part? They didn't even realize they were telling the truth. It was a Saturday evening in Savannah, Georgia. Dinner at the Ashford house was always an event. Not the warm, chaotic kind of family dinner most people imagine. The Ashfords didn't do chaos. Everything in their world was controlled, elegant, and quietly expensive. Their dining room looked like something out of a magazine. A long, polished oak table stretched nearly the length of the room, set with heavy silver cutlery and crystal glasses that caught the light from the chandelier above. A private chef moved silently between the kitchen and the table. Fresh flowers sat in the center, white hydrangeas, Diane's favorite. Diane was my mother-in-law. She believed in perfection, the way some people believe in religion. Presentation reflects character, she liked to say. That evening, there were nearly 20 people at the table. Trevor's father, Harrison Ashford, sat at the head, telling a story about a new investment deal his firm had just closed. A few of Trevor's cousins were visiting from Atlanta. There were 2 business partners, a neighbor and Veronica's fiancé. And then there was me. I sat halfway down the table beside my husband, Trevor. Technically, I was part of the family. But if you had walked into the room without context, you might have assumed I was one of the staff. That wasn't intentional cruelty. Not exactly. It was something quieter than that. Something more subtle. It was the way conversations flowed around me instead of through me. The way people spoke over me without noticing. The way my opinions were politely ignored and then repeated 5 minutes later by someone else who suddenly received praise. I had gotten used to it over the years. At first it bothered me. Then I learned how to smile. Smile, nod, stay pleasant. That had become my survival strategy in the Ashford family. Trevor sat beside me scrolling through his phone. That wasn't unusual either. Family dinners were mostly background noise for him. Trevor was the heir to Ashford Capital Management, a financial firm his father had built over 30 years. His life had always been planned out: private school, business degree, join the firm, eventually take over. Compared to the weight of that expectation, a dinner conversation barely registered. Across the table, Veronica was talking about her wedding. Veronica Ashford was Trevor's younger sister and the undisputed star of the family. She had that effortless confidence people develop when they grow up knowing the world will make room for them. Tall, stylish, perfectly composed. Even the way she held a wine glass looked intentional. "We finally secured the venue," she announced, leaning back in her chair. Everyone looked at her immediately. "What venue?" Diane asked. Veronica smiled, enjoying the suspense. "The Forsyte Mansion." The reaction was immediate. Gasps. Excited voices. Even Harrison looked impressed. "That place is booked 2 years out," one cousin said. Veronica nodded casually. Dad knew someone on the board. Of course he did. The Ashford name opened doors before anyone even knocked. Diane clasped her hands together in delight. "That venue is absolutely breathtaking. 25,000 just for the rental," Veronica added. Her fiancé Justin laughed. "Worth every dollar." Everyone began discussing the wedding plans. Flowers, music, guest lists. I listened quietly for a while. Then there was a small pause in the conversation. Just a moment of silence. And I made a mistake. I spoke. "That venue is beautiful," I said gently. "I actually coordinated a wedding there last spring." Several heads turned toward me. Encouraged, I continued. "If you're still looking for vendors, I could recommend a few florists who work well with that space." Veronica cut me off with a bright, sugary smile. "Oh, Emily." Her voice carried the same tone someone might use when correcting a child. "That's sweet, but we're working with premier vendors." She paused just long enough to make the next part sting. "Not really the level you deal with." A few quiet laughs spread around the table. Not loud. Not cruel. Just enough. My face warmed slightly, but I kept smiling. I had practice. I just thought my experience might help, I said. Veronica sighed dramatically. Then she waved her hand dismissively and said the sentence that would change my life. If you disappeared tomorrow, she said lightly, no one would even care. The table went silent for exactly half a second. Then people laughed. Real laughter. Trevor chuckled beside me. Diane hid a smile behind her napkin. Even Harrison grinned into his glass. No one defended me. No one said Veronica had gone too far. And in that moment, something inside me became very still. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt clarity. Because Veronica wasn't joking. She had simply said out loud what everyone at that table already believed. In their world, I was background noise, decoration, support staff, the wife who organized dinners and made sure everything ran smoothly, but not someone who truly mattered. And suddenly, for the first time in 7 years, I saw the situation clearly. I wasn't disappearing. I had already disappeared. I lifted my glass slowly. Sweet tea? No lemon. And I looked directly at Veronica. The room grew quiet again. What? She asked lightly. I smiled. Challenge accepted. For a moment no one understood what I meant. Trevor frowned slightly. Veronica blinked. Then Diane clapped her hands together brightly. Who wants Harrison to carve the roast? Conversation resumed instantly. The moment passed. Just another small family joke. Another comment lost among wine glasses and laughter. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. For the rest of dinner I barely spoke. Instead, I watched. I watched how easily the Ashfords moved through their world. The quiet confidence of people who had never had to question whether they belonged somewhere. And I listened to a voice inside me that had been whispering for years. You deserve better than this. The voice wasn't angry. It was calm. Certain. Finished. By the time we drove home that night, my decision had already been made. Trevor was still talking about golf plans for the next morning. I stared out the car window at the passing streetlights and silently began planning my disappearance. When we left the Ashford house that night, the drive home felt strangely quiet, even though Trevor was talking almost the entire time. He was reading something off his phone about a golf tournament he planned to attend with his father the next weekend. Normally, I would have nodded, asked a question, played my role in the conversation, but that night, I barely heard him. My mind kept returning to the moment at the dinner table. Not the laughter itself, but the feeling that came afterward, the realization that Veronica hadn't humiliated me. She had simply described the reality I had been living for years. Trevor finally glanced at me when we stopped at a red light. You're quiet tonight, he said casually. I'm just tired, I replied. He accepted that answer without another question. And that, in a strange way, explained almost everything about our marriage. Because if you want to understand how I reached the point where I could walk away from my life in a single day, you have to understand the 7 years that came before it. Leaving didn't happen suddenly. It was the result of years of small moments, moments that seemed insignificant by themselves, but together slowly erased the person I used to be. I met Trevor when I was 23 years old. At the time, I was finishing my final semester at Georgia Southern University, studying hospitality management. My life looked very different back then. I had a scholarship, 2 part-time jobs, and a clear plan for the future. I wanted to build a career in event management. I loved the creativity of it, the logistics, the atmosphere, the way a well-planned event could make people feel something unforgettable. Money had always been tight growing up. My father owned a small auto repair shop in a town about 2.5 hours from Savannah. My mother cleaned houses, often for families who lived in neighborhoods far nicer than the one we grew up in. She left before sunrise most mornings and came home smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and expensive laundry detergent that wasn't ours. But my parents never complained. They simply worked. And they taught me that if I wanted a different life, I would have to build it myself. The country club job was part of that plan. I worked behind the bar on weekends, serving drinks to members who treated the place like a second home. It paid $15 an hour plus tips, more money than any other campus job I could find. Trevor came in one evening with a group from his father's firm. He ordered a bourbon and noticed the book I had tucked behind the register. Hospitality Marketing, he read aloud from the spine. Studying business? Hospitality management, I corrected with a smile. I graduate in December. He looked genuinely impressed. Most people I know got through college without opening a textbook. I laughed. Must be nice. It was, he admitted, but maybe not very useful. We talked for nearly 20 minutes that night between drink orders. Trevor was charming in a quiet way. He didn't act like most of the wealthy members who came through the club. He asked questions about my classes, my plans, my family. He seemed curious about things outside his own world. When he asked for my number, I hesitated for a moment. You could tell Trevor came from money. His watch alone probably cost more than my car. But something about him felt different, more grounded, less arrogant. At least, that's what I believed at the time. 3 months later, we were inseparable. Trevor drove down from Savannah almost every weekend to see me. We spent hours wandering through the small downtown streets near campus, drinking coffee, talking about our futures. He told me about the pressure of being the Ashford heir, about the expectations, about how sometimes he wished he could escape it all. You're the most real person I've met in years, he told me once, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. Everyone in my world is performing. I believed him. I believed that he saw me clearly. What I didn't realize was that he only saw me clearly when we were outside his world. Once I stepped into it, everything began to change. We got engaged 6 months after I graduated. The ring was enormous. It probably cost more than my entire student loan balance. My friends were thrilled for me. My parents were proud but a little nervous. My mother asked me a question the night after Trevor proposed. "Baby," she said carefully, "are you sure you're ready for a life like that?" I didn't understand what she meant. "A life like what?" "With people who have always had everything," she said quietly. I laughed it off at the time. I thought love would make those differences irrelevant. I was wrong. Our wedding happened in 2018. Diane organized most of it. "You're so busy with your little event job," she told me one afternoon while flipping through venue catalogs. "Let me handle the details. I know how things should be done." At the time, I thought she was being helpful. Now I understand she was setting the pattern that would define my role in the family. The first real sacrifice came 4 months after we got married. I received a call from a recruiter at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta. They were offering me an assistant manager position in their events department. The salary was $52,000 a year, with benefits and a clear promotion path. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I had dreamed about. I was thrilled when I told Trevor that evening. But his reaction wasn't what I expected. "Atlanta?" he repeated slowly. "It's only 3 hours away," I said quickly. "We could commute on weekends." Trevor took my hands. "Emily, my dad needs me here. He's preparing me to take on more responsibility at the firm." "And my career?" I asked. "You'll find something in Savannah," he said gently. "We're building a life together. That matters more than one job." The way he said it made it sound obvious. Logical. Reasonable. So I turned down the Ritz-Carlton. Instead, I accepted a position at a small venue in Savannah called The Pearl. The salary was $34,000 a year, $18,000 less than the Atlanta offer. When Diane heard about it at Sunday dinner, she smiled politely. "Oh, The Pearl," she said. "How quaint." Trevor squeezed my hand under the table. His silent signal, "Don't respond." So I smiled and changed the subject. That became my strategy. Smile. Nod. Change the subject. The second sacrifice was financial. By 2019, I had saved $43,000. It had taken years of careful budgeting and working multiple jobs during college. It was my safety net, the proof that I could stand on my own if I ever needed to. That same year, Veronica launched a startup, an app designed to connect event venues with service vendors. At a family dinner, Harrison asked my opinion about the concept. I gave honest feedback. The idea had potential, but needed some improvements to the interface. 2 weeks later, Veronica approached me privately. "Would you like to invest?" she asked. Trevor encouraged it. "It's family," he said. "We support each other." So I invested $28,000. The company folded a year and a half later. Veronica shrugged it off like a minor inconvenience. That's what family does, she said when I asked about the investment. We support each other's dreams. Apparently, that rule only worked in one direction. The third sacrifice was harder to measure. It happened slowly, in ways I didn't notice until much later. I changed how I dressed. I softened my opinions. I stopped offering suggestions unless someone asked directly. At family gatherings, I was often seated with elderly relatives or distant cousins, anyone who wouldn't disrupt the more important conversations happening elsewhere. Over time, my voice became quieter. My confidence faded. I started second-guessing everything, even my work. By the summer of 2023, I barely recognized the woman I saw in the mirror. And when Veronica said that night at dinner, "If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even care," she wasn't inventing something cruel. She was describing the reality that 7 years inside the Ashford family had quietly created. And for the first time, I finally saw it too. The strange thing about life-changing decisions is that they rarely feel dramatic in the moment. There was no shouting that night, no slammed doors, no emotional confrontation. After the dinner ended and we drove home, the house felt exactly the same as it had every other night. The lights in the hallway glowed softly. The air smelled faintly of the lavender candles Diane liked to give us as gifts, and Trevor tossed his car keys onto the entry table like he always did. He loosened his tie and stretched his shoulders. "Dad wants to play golf early tomorrow," he said. "I'll probably leave around 8. I nodded, hanging my purse on the hook by the door. "Okay." He disappeared upstairs to shower while I stood in the kitchen for a moment longer than necessary. I watched the refrigerator light glow when I opened it, though I wasn't hungry. Everything looked normal. The house, the quiet hum of appliances, the perfectly organized cabinets. From the outside, it looked like a life anyone would envy. But inside, something had already shifted. Veronica's words kept replaying in my mind. "If you disappeared tomorrow, no one would even care." The worst part wasn't the insult, it was the silence that followed it. The laughter that filled the room while Trevor chuckled beside me as if it were harmless family teasing. That was the moment I realized something important. No one in that room saw me. And if no one saw me, then leaving wouldn't actually break anything. Trevor came downstairs about 20 minutes later, hair damp from the shower. We sat on the couch and watched half an episode of some show he liked. I couldn't even tell you what it was about now. My thoughts were somewhere else entirely. By 10:30, Trevor was yawning. "Long week," he muttered. "I'm going to bed." I followed him upstairs, brushing my teeth beside him at the sink, going through the routine of normal life. When he fell asleep, it happened quickly, the way it always did. Within minutes, his breathing deepened, steady and relaxed. I lay there in the dark for a while, staring at the ceiling. My mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. Not angry, not emotional, just certain. Finally, I slipped quietly out of bed. I walked down the hallway to the small office room Trevor rarely used. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the surface as I opened my laptop. My hands moved almost automatically, as if the plan had been forming long before that dinner. The first thing I searched for was apartments in Charleston. Charleston had always been one of my favorite cities. It was only 2 hours away, close enough to feel familiar but far enough that the Ashford family wouldn't run into me by accident. Several listings appeared. I clicked through photos of small studios and one-bedroom apartments, nothing luxurious, but clean, simple, independent. The second thing I searched for was divorce attorneys. That search made my stomach tighten slightly. Not because I doubted the decision, but because typing those words made it real. I didn't contact anyone that night. I just read. I wanted to understand the process, the timeline, what separating finances would look like. Then I opened our bank account. Trevor and I shared one primary account for household expenses, along with 2 personal savings accounts. I stared at the numbers for a long moment. Technically, half of it belonged to me, but I knew how the Ashfords thought. If I took more than what was clearly fair, it would become another story about how I had taken advantage of their family. So, I transferred exactly half of the shared balance into my personal account. Not a dollar more. not a dollar less. After that, I began making a list. It was surprisingly calm work. Laptop, important documents, clothes that belonged to me, family photos, grandma's peach pie recipe card. The list was short. 7 years of marriage, and the things that truly felt like mine could fit in a few boxes. Around 1 in the morning, I texted someone. Jenna. Jenna had been my roommate during my last year of college and the closest thing I had to a sister. She lived in Charleston now, working as a graphic designer. She replied almost immediately. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a moment before typing back. Not really. Can you come tomorrow? There was a pause. Then 3 dots appeared. Of course. I closed the laptop after that and returned to bed. Trevor shifted slightly when I slipped under the covers, but he didn't wake up. For the first time in years, I slept deeply. The next morning, Trevor left at exactly 8. He kissed my cheek on the way out the door. See you later, he said casually. Have fun, I replied. The door closed behind him, and I stood there in the quiet house. For a moment, I expected to feel panic, fear, second thoughts. Instead, I felt something else. Relief. Jenna arrived around 11 in the morning. Her small hatchback pulled into the driveway, and she stepped out wearing sunglasses and holding 2 coffees. She took one look at my face and wrapped me in a hug. You're serious about this, aren't you? She asked softly. I nodded. I think I've been serious for a long time. I just didn't realize it. We didn't waste time after that. Jenna helped me gather everything on the list. Clothes went into suitcases, books into cardboard boxes, important documents into a small folder that stayed in my bag. The process felt strangely efficient, like dismantling a stage set after a play ends. At one point, Jenna paused in the hallway. That's it? She asked, looking around. I glanced at the empty closet shelves. Yeah, I said quietly. That's it. By early afternoon, the car was packed. Before leaving, I sat down at the kitchen counter with a pen and a single sheet of paper. I thought about writing something long, explaining everything, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Trevor wouldn't suddenly understand 7 years of slow invisibility just because I described it in a letter. So I kept it simple. Trevor, I need time away to rethink our marriage. I've transferred half of the shared account into my savings. I'm safe and I'll contact you once I've settled somewhere. Emily. I folded the paper and placed it beside my wedding ring. The ring caught the light for a moment, before I turned away. Then Jenna and I carried the last box outside. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked at the house one final time. 7 years of my life had happened there. But strangely, it didn't feel like leaving home. The drive north toward South Carolina felt different than any road trip I had taken before. The further we went, the lighter the air felt in my chest. About an hour into the drive, Jenna glanced at me. You okay? I looked out the window at the passing trees. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Yeah, I said. Actually, I think I am. When the car crossed the South Carolina state line, I felt something loosen inside me. Not anger. Not sadness. Just space. The kind of space that comes when a chapter finally ends. Behind me was a life where I had slowly disappeared. Ahead of me was something uncertain. But for the first time in years, it was also completely mine. When I first arrived in Charleston, the city felt both familiar and completely new at the same time. I had visited before short trips for weddings or small conferences, but living there was different. The streets seemed slower. The air smelled faintly of salt and jasmine, and the sound of boats moving through the harbor carried into the quiet mornings. Jenna let me stay with her for the first 2 weeks. Her apartment was small, but full of light. The living room window overlooked a narrow street lined with old brick buildings, and every morning a bakery across the road filled the air with the smell of fresh bread. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't part of the polished world the Ashfords lived in. But it felt peaceful. For the first few days, I did something I hadn't done in years. Nothing. I slept late. I walked along the waterfront in the evenings. I sat in small coffee shops with my laptop and watched people come and go. No one there knew my name. No one knew my past. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't someone's wife, someone's daughter-in-law, someone trying to prove she belonged somewhere. I was just Emily. But peace doesn't pay rent. and after 2 weeks I knew I needed to start rebuilding my life. So I began applying for jobs. The hospitality industry in Charleston was competitive, but it was also full of opportunity. Weddings, corporate retreats, destination events. The city had become a magnet for celebrations of every kind. One of the places I applied to was a boutique hotel called the Grand Palmetto. The building itself was beautiful, an old, restored mansion with tall white columns and wide porches that overlooked the harbor. The kind of place where people hosted elegant weddings and private gatherings. I almost didn't send the application. Part of me still carried the quiet doubt that had grown inside me during those years with the Ashfords. The voice that whispered, maybe I wasn't good enough for places like that. But something in me had changed too. Instead of listening to that voice, I clicked, submit. 2 days later, I received an email asking me to come in for an interview. The owner of the hotel, Catherine Hughes, conducted the interview herself. Catherine was in her early 60s, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and eyes that seemed to notice everything. She didn't waste time with small talk. She glanced briefly at my resume before setting it aside. "Tell me about the best event you've ever designed," she said. I described a charity gala I had helped organize 2 years earlier at the Pearl in Savannah. It had been a small budget event, but we had transformed the entire ballroom using soft lighting, local flowers, and simple but elegant table settings. Catherine listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "You're holding something back," she said. I blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "You're describing the logistics," she continued calmly. "But events aren't about logistics. They're about atmosphere, emotion. Tell me what you actually wanted that room to feel like." No one had ever asked me that question in an interview before. So I answered honestly. "I wanted people to walk in and feel like the night mattered," I said slowly. "Like they were stepping into a memory before it even happened." Catherine watched me for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "When can you start?" I must have looked stunned, because she smiled slightly. "You've spent too long working in places where no one listens to your ideas," she said. "I can tell." And somehow, she was right. I started working at the Grand Palmetto the following Monday. At first, my position was simple: event coordinator. I helped manage bookings, worked with vendors, organized schedules, and assisted couples planning weddings. But Catherine noticed things quickly. Within 3 months, she began giving me more responsibility. "Handle this one yourself," she would say, handing me a new contract or client file. Then, 6 months later, she promoted me to operations manager. The promotion doubled my responsibilities and nearly doubled my salary. But the biggest change wasn't the money. It was the confidence slowly returning to me. At the Grand Palmetto, my ideas were welcomed. When I suggested different lighting layouts or creative themes for events, Catherine didn't dismiss them. She tested them. Sometimes they worked beautifully, sometimes they failed, but either way, they were mine. Around that time, Trevor finally contacted me. The divorce process had been surprisingly quiet. His lawyer handled most of the communication through email. There were no dramatic arguments, no public accusations, just paperwork and signatures. One evening, my phone rang with Trevor's name on the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "Hi." There was a pause. "I heard you moved to Charleston." "Yes. You sound different." "I feel different." Another silence stretched between us. "I guess I didn't realize things were that bad," he admitted quietly. For a moment, I considered explaining everything. All the small ways the Ashford family had erased me over the years. But I realized something important. He wouldn't understand. Not because he was cruel, but because he had never lived outside that world. "I hope you're doing well, Trevor," I said gently. "You too, Emily." And that was the end of the conversation. A few months later, Catherine invited me to lunch. We sat at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the marina. Halfway through the meal, she placed a folder on the table. "I want to show you something," she said. Inside the folder were architectural sketches, plans for renovating an old estate property just outside the city. "This place has incredible potential as a wedding venue," Catherine explained. "Waterfront views, large gardens, historic charm." I studied the drawings carefully. "It's beautiful," I said. Then she looked at me directly. I'm getting older, Emily. Running the hotel and expanding the business is becoming too much. I wasn't sure where the conversation was going until she said the next sentence. I want you to become my partner. I stared at her in disbelief. Partner? You'd invest time, not money, she clarified. You'd manage operations and help design the event experience. In return, you'd receive 30% ownership. For a moment, I couldn't speak. A year earlier, I had been sitting at a dinner table where people laughed at the idea that my existence mattered. Now, someone was offering me ownership of a business. Not because of my last name, but because of my work. I finally nodded slowly. Yes, I said, and just like that, a new chapter of my life began. Over the next several months, we renovated the property. The gardens were restored. The ballroom was redesigned with soft, neutral tones and tall windows that opened toward the water. We named the venue Marion Estate. When the first wedding took place there, I stood quietly at the back of the room, watching the bride walk down the aisle. Catherine leaned over beside me. Feels different, doesn't it? She said. I nodded. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't invisible in the room. I was the reason the room existed. By the time Marion Estate had been open for nearly 6 months, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal compared to the one I used to live. Most mornings started early. I would walk through the gardens before the staff arrived, checking the flowers, making sure the lanterns were still aligned along the stone paths, and listening to the quiet hum of the harbor beyond the trees. Weddings are strange things to manage. Every couple believes their day is the most important event in the world, and in a way, it is. My job was to protect that moment for them. The estate had quickly gained a reputation. Word spread faster than we expected. Photographers posted pictures online, brides recommended us in forums, and planners began calling months in advance asking about availability. Some days my inbox filled with more inquiries than I could answer before noon. Catherine joked that I had accidentally turned her quiet retirement project into a thriving business. Careful, she told me one afternoon as we stood overlooking the lawn where a ceremony arch was being installed. If this place gets any more popular, we'll need to start turning people away. I laughed. That's a good problem to have. At the time, neither of us realized just how strange that problem was about to become. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had arrived early, coffee in hand, planning to review vendor contracts for an upcoming spring wedding. The office windows were open, letting in the soft coastal breeze that always carried the faint scent of salt water. My email inbox showed 12 new messages. Most of them were routine inquiries, dates, pricing questions, requests for venue tours. Then one subject line caught my attention. Wedding inquiry, August 17. I clicked it open without thinking much about it. The message was polite and professionally written. The sender explained that their original venue had been unexpectedly lost due to a fire, and they were urgently searching for a replacement location for their wedding scheduled 6 weeks away. That wasn't unusual. Emergencies happen in the event industry more often than people realize. Venues flood, storms damage properties, renovations fall behind schedule. What made my breath pause for a moment was the name at the bottom of the email. Bride, Veronica Ashford. I stared at the screen. For a few seconds, my mind simply refused to process the words. Veronica Ashford, Trevor's sister. The same Veronica who had laughed across a dinner table and told everyone my disappearance wouldn't matter. I leaned back slowly in my chair, reading the email again to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. No, it was definitely her. Apparently, the Forsyte Mansion, the extravagant venue she had bragged about that night, had suffered a serious electrical fire in one of the main reception halls. The damage was extensive enough that the entire property had been forced to cancel upcoming events, including Veronica's wedding. And now she was looking for a replacement venue. I glanced down at the calendar on my desk. August 17. Our availability chart showed only one open date left in that entire month. That date. For a moment, the situation felt surreal. Of all the venues Veronica could have contacted, somehow her request had landed on my desk. Or maybe it hadn't been chance at all. Marion Estate had become one of the most sought-after wedding locations in Charleston in a surprisingly short time. Event planners talked to each other. Photographers recommended venues they loved working at. If Veronica's team had searched for alternatives in the region, our estate would have appeared near the top of every list. Still, the irony made me sit quietly for a long moment. Catherine walked into the office just then, carrying a stack of fabric samples for an upcoming wedding. "Morning," she said, setting the samples down. "You look like someone just told you the garden caught fire." I turned the laptop toward her. "Take a look at this." She adjusted her glasses and read the email carefully. When she reached the name at the bottom, her eyebrows lifted. "Well," she said slowly, "that's interesting. You could say that." She leaned against the desk, considering the situation. "This is the same sister-in-law you told me about, right?" she asked. "The one who made that comment at dinner?" "Yes." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "So the question becomes, what do you want to do?" I knew exactly what she meant. As co-owner, I had the authority to decline the booking if I wanted. There were plenty of reasons I could give short notice: scheduling complications, logistical challenges. No one would question it. Veronica would simply move on to the next available venue. Part of me felt tempted, not because I wanted revenge, but because accepting the booking meant inviting the Ashford family back into my life in some way, and I had worked hard to leave that world behind. Catherine studied my expression. "You don't owe them anything," she said quietly. "I know." "So?" I turned my chair slightly, looking out the office window toward the gardens. A staff member was adjusting the white chairs from the previous weekend's ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the oak trees, creating shifting patterns across the grass. For a moment I imagined what Veronica's reaction might be if she discovered who owned Marion Estate. Would she be embarrassed? Angry? Dismissive? Then another thought occurred to me. If I declined the booking, nothing would change. The Ashford family would continue living their lives exactly as before, never realizing how much my own life had changed. But, if I accepted, they would eventually find out. Not through confrontation, not through revenge, just through reality. I turned back to Catherine. "We accept the booking," I said. She smiled slightly. "I thought you might say that." I drafted the reply email carefully. Professional, neutral, no personal tone whatsoever. "Dear Miss Ashford, thank you for reaching out. I'm sorry to hear about the situation with your original venue. Marion Estate currently has availability on August 17, and we would be happy to discuss hosting your wedding celebration. I've attached our pricing guide and scheduling options. Please let us know if you'd like to arrange a consultation. Best regards, Emily Crawford, Operations Manager, Marion Estate." I hesitated for half a second before pressing send. Not because I doubted the decision, but because I knew something strange had just begun. Within 2 hours, Veronica's wedding planner responded. They wanted to book the date immediately. 6 weeks. That was all the time we had to prepare. Normally, I would have scheduled a planning call with the bride right away. But in this case, the planner handled almost everything through email. Veronica herself never contacted me directly, which meant she probably had no idea who I was. Over the next several weeks, the wedding preparations moved quickly. Vendor contracts were confirmed. Floral arrangements were redesigned to match Marion Estate's garden layout. The seating plan was adjusted for the ballroom capacity. Every detail was handled with the same care we gave any couple. Professional. Precise. Perfect. Catherine watched the process unfold with quiet amusement. "You realize," she said one afternoon as we finalized the reception layout, "this might be the most poetic event planning situation I've ever seen." I laughed softly. "I'm not planning poetry. I'm planning a wedding." "Yes," she said. "But sometimes those two things become the same." As the wedding day approached, I wondered if Veronica would recognize my name on the paperwork. But apparently, she never noticed. Or perhaps she simply never expected the possibility. After all, in her mind, I had disappeared. And according to her own words, no one would have cared. The morning of August 17 arrived with the kind of golden sunlight Charleston seems to reserve for special occasions. I arrived at Marion Estate before 6, long before the first vendor trucks rolled through the gates. The gardens were still quiet, dew resting lightly on the grass, the harbor beyond the trees calm and silver in the early light. Days like this were always important for me. Weddings are fragile moments, months of planning, condensed into a few emotional hours, and I like to begin them in silence, walking the grounds before the chaos began. I followed the stone path through the gardens, checking the ceremony chairs one last time. White roses and eucalyptus had been woven into the arch overlooking the water. The florist had done beautiful work. For a brief moment, standing there alone, I allowed myself to appreciate how far this place had come. 1 year earlier, Marion Estate had been an abandoned property with cracked windows and overgrown hedges. Now it was hosting one of the largest weddings of the season, and the bride walking down that aisle would be Veronica Ashford. The thought still carried a strange weight, but not the kind I might have expected months earlier. There was no anger left, no lingering resentment, just a quiet sense of closure waiting somewhere later in the day. By 7 o'clock, the estate was beginning to wake up. The catering team arrived first, unloading trays and equipment through the service entrance. Soon after that, the florist returned with additional arrangements for the reception hall. Music equipment followed, then the photographer's crew. The entire property gradually filled with the organized chaos that precedes every wedding. I moved between teams, checking details, confirming timelines, adjusting small things that only someone running the event would notice. A tablecloth that needed straightening, a lighting fixture that required a slight adjustment, a change in the cocktail hour layout to improve the flow of guests. From the outside, I looked exactly like I always did on event days, focused, calm, professional. Inside, though, there was a quiet awareness building. Soon the Ashford family would arrive. Around 10 o'clock, the first bridal party cars rolled through the gates. Black SUVs lined the circular driveway as assistants hurried to guide guests toward the preparation suites inside the estate. I stayed in the reception hall for a while longer, reviewing the seating arrangement with the planner Veronica had hired. She was efficient and polite, clearly relieved that Marion Estate had been able to accommodate the last-minute booking. Honestly, we were terrified after the fire at Forsyte Mansion, she admitted as we checked the place cards. Finding a venue this beautiful on such short notice felt like a miracle. I smiled politely. Sometimes things work out exactly the way they're supposed to. The ceremony itself was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon, but by early afternoon the estate was already filled with guests. Elegant dresses moved through the gardens, laughter drifted across the lawn. Champagne glasses appeared in the hands of people enjoying the warm coastal air. I watched everything from a distance at first, making sure the schedule remained on track. Then, around 3:30, a familiar car pulled into the driveway, a dark blue Mercedes. Trevor stepped out first. For a brief moment, I felt my heart pause. He looked almost exactly the same as the last time I had seen him, tall, composed, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than my first apartment's rent. But something about him seemed slightly different, too. Maybe it was the hesitation in the way he looked around the estate, as if trying to understand the place before stepping fully into it. Behind him, Harrison and Diane climbed out of another car. Diane adjusted her hat carefully, glancing around with approval at the manicured gardens. Harrison spoke with one of the ushers near the entrance. None of them had noticed me yet, which was understandable. I was standing near the back of the property, speaking with one of the catering managers. The ceremony began exactly on schedule. Music drifted softly through the speakers as guests took their seats along the garden aisle. The ocean breeze carried the scent of flowers across the lawn. I stood near the edge of the crowd, just far enough away to observe without interrupting the moment. When Veronica finally appeared at the start of the aisle, she looked exactly the way she always had, confident, radiant, perfectly composed. Her dress was elegant, her posture flawless, her smile bright as she walked toward the altar. For a moment I wondered if she had any idea how close our lives had come to intersecting again. But if she did, she gave no sign. The ceremony was beautiful. Short, heartfelt, filled with the kind of emotion that makes weddings feel like small worlds of their own. Guests applauded when the couple kissed. Cameras flashed. Music swelled as the newlyweds walked back down the aisle together. Then came the reception. Inside the ballroom, golden lights reflected off tall glass centerpieces. The band began playing soft jazz as guests found their tables. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne while the bridal party prepared for the formal introductions. This was the part of the evening where my presence usually became more visible. I needed to coordinate with the band, confirm the dinner schedule, and ensure the staff stayed aligned with the timeline. So I stepped into the ballroom. At first, no one noticed. Most guests were focused on greeting each other, finding seats, admiring the decorations. Then, Veronica turned. I saw the exact moment she recognized me. Her expression froze. Not dramatically, just a small pause in her movement, like someone who had suddenly seen something impossible. Trevor followed her gaze. His reaction was quieter, but just as unmistakable. Diane looked up from her conversation with one of the bridesmaids and nearly dropped the glass she was holding. The room itself continued buzzing with conversation, but the small circle around their table had gone completely silent. I walked toward them calmly, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady. When I reached the edge of the table, I smiled politely. "Good evening," I said. For a moment, none of them spoke. Veronica finally found her voice. "Emily?" Her tone carried equal parts confusion and disbelief. I nodded slightly. "Yes." Then I added the part that completed the picture. "I'm Emily Crawford," I said calmly, co-owner of Marion Estate. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Harrison's eyes moved slowly around the ballroom, the decorations, the lighting, the perfectly arranged reception hall. All of it. Trevor looked at me as if seeing someone entirely unfamiliar. And Veronica seemed to remember something. A sentence spoken casually at a dinner table a year earlier. She stared at me for a long moment. Then I said something softly enough that only they could hear. "You once said that if I disappeared, no one would even care." I gestured lightly toward the room around us. "Everything you see tonight. This is what happens when someone is finally seen." For a second longer we stood there in silence. Then I turned and walked back toward the staff area to continue managing the reception. Because in the end, the night wasn't about revenge. It was about something much simpler. I hadn't come back to prove anything to them. I had simply come back as someone who no longer needed their approval to exist. Stories like this aren't really about revenge. On the surface, it may look like a perfect moment of karma, the woman who was once ignored and belittled, returning stronger, more successful, and impossible to overlook. But the deeper truth of this story is something much quieter and much more powerful. For years, I believed that if I tried harder, spoke more carefully, and sacrificed a little more of myself, I would finally earn a place at that table. But the truth is, the right people never ask you to disappear in order to belong. When someone truly values you, they don't make you smaller, they make room for you to grow. Sometimes life changes not because we fight back, but because we finally walk away. And when we do, we often discover that the person we were meant to become was waiting for us all along. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in a place where you were supposed to feel at home, then you're not alone. Many powerful stories begin exactly that way. Thank you for listening to this journey. And if you enjoy emotional storytelling like this, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tale Network. Here, we share stories about resilience, quiet strength, and the unexpected ways life can turn around when we choose ourselves.